lose myself. Everything I found, dear, I've not found by myself. Try and sometimes you'll succeed to make this man of me. All my stolen missing parts I've no need for anymore. And I believe, 'cause I can see our future days, days of you.
We're smuggling her?
I want Joel to watch over her.
Whoa, I don't think
Bullshit,
that's
I'm
the
not
best
gonna
Ellie.
leave
idea.
him.
What are you doing?
When I was
Killing time.
young, I
Well,
focused
what am I supposed to do?
on a prayer.
I am sure you will figure that out.
You came deep as in the ocean. Did something out there here. All the complexities and games. No one wins, but somehow they still play. All the missing crooked hearts. They may die, but in us they live on. And I believe, 'cause I can see our future days, days of you and me. When hurricanes and cyclones reach, when winds turn dirt to dust, when floods they came,
But it grows all over the brain.
ever closer became us.
It does.
Find someone else.
Sundown, I met them like the rest. All the demons used to come round. I'm grateful.
I swear.
Making a vaccine. Angel, I am here to stay. No resistance, no
Would have killed you.
Please, this is just too good to be gone. And I believe. And
So I stopped them.
'Cause I can see our future days, days of you and me, you and me. It's just you and me. If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
This is a video I said I was going to do during my previous Last of Us Part 2 video, the betrayal of Ellie. I've been stressing for months now about how I was going to approach this video. At first I wanted to start with an analysis into Joel Miller and look into what made him come across as a very humanistic character and what drove him to make that final decision at the end of the first game. Then obviously I realised that I now have to factor part 2 into the equation, and we all know how that narrative went. So I've decided to stick with the analysis of Joel, to see what made him human and what drove him to his choices and priorities. I'm also going to discuss the discourse that is still circulating within the community over his choice to save Ellie, as well as his decision and actions in part 2. I will be looking to both arguments as to why Joel saved Ellie, in which some called out Joel for becoming a morally grey character, and some hailing him as a hero, and also as to why he blindly walked into Abby's improvised ambush in part 2. Of course, I also will be recapping both narratives to back up points I will mention, as well as what the writers were trying to achieve across both games with Joel, as well as his actions. And of course I do have problems with what was being pushed, mostly in part 2's narrative. Like I say, I will try to give a balanced explanation to both sides, then give a conclusion towards the end, to finally answer the question, did Joel deserve better? Now I don't know how long this video is going to be yet, so I warn you now, grab a drink as this might be another long haul. Also, spoilers ahead. So let's briefly take a look at Joel in The Last of Us Part 1. Before the collapse, Joel was a hard-working single parent in Texas. When the collapse occurred in 2013, Joel and his daughter, Sarah, were celebrating his birthday, after him arriving home after a long shift at work. Sarah gives him his present, a new watch to replace his old one. I will be bringing up this watch on multiple points later. Eventually Joel and Sarah become aware of the situation, as Joel accidentally leads a runner into the house. The pair try to make an escape to safety, whilst being accompanied by his brother, Tommy. Whilst making their way to the military checkpoint, they are involved in a car accident, leaving Sarah's leg broken. When approaching closer to the checkpoint, a lone soldier on the outskirts follows orders from a superior and opens fire on the pair, hitting and killing Sarah. This turns Joel from that hard-working man, a loving father, into a ruthless survivor. He and Tommy now spend the next 20 years surviving in this new collapsed America. In this time, Joel, as well as Tommy, have done unspeakable things to survive, even crossing between both sides. Joel even admits this to Ellie about halfway through the game.
How did you know
Know what?
about the ambush?
I've been on both sides.
Oh. So, you kill a lot of innocent people? We'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
Somewhere in this time, Joel and Tommy go their separate ways, with Joel heading east and Tommy staying within the Wyoming area with the Fireflies. This part of Joel's life we don't see. We don't pick up with Joel again until 20 years after the death of Sarah. He is now residing in a safe zone run by the military in Boston. The first thing we notice is that he is still wearing the watch Sarah bought him all those years ago. He is still struggling to cope with the loss of Sarah. 20 years on, it is also apparent that Joel has not shared much about his past life to his peers, as we find out later on in the narrative in the Capitol building. Within the safe zone, Joel is now a smuggler of illegal goods, such as firearms. He and his business partner, Tess, take on a job for Marlene, the leader of the militia group, the Fireflies, to escort a young girl, Ellie, to the Capitol building, just outside the safe zone, in exchange for some firearms that were wrongfully sold to the Fireflies. Joel at first detests the idea. Straight away I knew there was a defence reaction by Joel. He does not want to watch over Ellie. He has doubted himself since the death of Sarah that he cannot protect anyone, especially one such girl that reminds him of Sarah. But of course, we know how that narrative goes. Joel goes along with the deal and escorts Ellie to the Capitol building with Tess, with the pair still not knowing why exactly they're escorting her and as to why she's so important to the Fireflies. Of course, along the way, Joel and Tess learn of Ellie's condition, They don't exactly react well when they find out. When arriving at the drop-off, we lose Tess to infection after a previous ambush by infected, confirming to Joel that Ellie's condition is legitimate. Joel decides to honour Tess's wish and gets Ellie to Tommy's location. It's revealed earlier by Ellie that the original crew at the Capitol building were meant to take Ellie to a research lab in Colorado. Tommy obviously used to be a Firefly and will certainly know where that lab is. The rest of the game now consists of Joel and Ellie travelling halfway across the remains of the United States in search of finding a cure for her condition regarding the cordyceps fungus, that she is somehow not affected by its symptoms. Not only do Joel and Ellie have to fight their way across the country, but also survive against infected as well as alive and well humans. But worst of all for the pair, they have to get to know each other and build a layer of trust, which is hard to come by in this world. Joel certainly at first comes across distrusting of Ellie through these early segments. A lot of it is because he does not want to become overly attached to her. I have explained this in previous videos, that Joel was reluctant to give Ellie a firearm. At first I did think this was distrust, or Joel trying to do the morally right thing, not to give her one, to protect her mental well-being, because as we saw, Ellie was traumatised when she had to put down that hunter that was attacking Joel. I also think Joel was trying to redeem something in himself, that he will try to protect Ellie because he felt he failed Sarah. Upon reflection, looking back at earlier cutscenes, even when he barely knew Ellie at the start, she straight away reminded him of Sarah. How can we tell this, you ask? Take a look at this.
So is that everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, can't deny that view.
Come on, this way. Hey, let's pick it up.
It's another piece of genius writing and planning by Neil and Bruce. Nothing has to be said and you understand what Joel is thinking. I feel this is why he came across as being so defensive after Ellie saved him. He wanted to do what he could to protect her, not the latter. But of course, just like I mentioned, he does eventually open up and allow Ellie to fight alongside him, along with showing some empathy towards her.
Oh, shit. Come here, keep your head down. All right, now, I'm gonna jump down there and I'm gonna clear us a path.
What about me?
You stay here.
This is so stupid. We'd have more of a fucking chance if you let me help.
I am. You seem to know your way around a gun. You reckon you can handle that?
Well, I sort of shot a rifle before, but it was at rats
Rats.
with BBs.
Well, it's the same basic concept. Lift it up. All right, now, you're going to lean right into that stock, because it is going to kick a hell of a lot more than any baby rifle.
Okay.
Go and pull the bolt back. Grab it right there. Just tug it. There you go. And as soon as you fire, you're going to want to get another round in there quick. Listen to me. If I get into trouble down there, you make every shot count. Yeah?
I got this.
All right. And just so we're clear about back there, it was either him or me.
You're welcome.
It is very apparent in the early stages of the game, Joel is not like any other playable character we've come across in a video game. I'm holding off on calling him a protagonist or antagonist for now. I think we can agree though, Neil Druckmann, the creative director for Part 1 and 2, and Bruce Straley, the game director for Part 1, and of course, Troy Baker, did an incredible job bringing a three-dimensional character to life, and has a very human personality that makes us empathise with the weight of his choices. Through the narrative, small moments occur between Joel and Ellie. Their trust and relationship grows. Joel still holds off slightly, but Ellie's optimism is what keeps them going. But of course, along the way, they do have some skirmishes. Along with the pair experiencing a fair amount of close calls with infected, as well as hunters, this unnerves Joel. He is sinking back to that place in his head that he cannot protect anyone. And of course he doesn't want to go through more trauma of losing another daughter, so to speak. When he reaches Tommy's dam, he tries to offload Ellie onto Tommy to complete the journey to Colorado. Of course, Ellie puts two and two together and goes AWOL. Joel and Tommy catch up to her and the pair have a chat.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys, movies, deciding which shirt goes with which skirt. It's bizarre.
Get up. We're leaving. Come on.
And if I say no?
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk? It's pretty goddamn stupid.
Well, I guess we're both disappointed with each other then.
What do you want from me?
Admit that you wanted to get rid of me the whole time.
Tommy knows this area.
Oh,
better
fuck
than...
that.
Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways. Get it together. We're not alone.
After this conversation, Joel realises he needs Ellie more than he realises. I don't think he actually realised how much Ellie needed him either. Again, although Joel pushing Ellie away like this is another form of a defence mechanism, he doesn't want to do it, but he feels she would be safer under Tommy and a crew, because he truly feels he cannot protect her up to this point. But like I just mentioned, he does come to his senses and realises they do need each other, and like Ellie said, they do seem to be doing alright so far. The pair push onwards to Colorado, but learn later the whole Firefly research crew have moved to Salt Lake City. Joel gets injured whilst leaving the university after an ambush by David's crew. Of course, Ellie steps up and gets them both to safety and cares for Joel through the winter. After this segment in the spring, after Ellie's traumatic events with David, I have mentioned this before, Ellie is now a little pessimistic and Joel is now optimistic. However, when I was doing my research for this video, analysing gameplay and cutscenes, I noticed in this section that although Joel is seemingly optimistic, after all the close calls they've had, especially after what happened to Ellie, Joel knows in reality humankind is not worth saving. 20 years into the collapse, most people are too far gone to save. You tend to see lots of instances like this in AMC's The Walking Dead. I know I did refer to The Walking Dead in the last video I made about the Last of Us franchise, but these worlds are very similar, and I think Rick and Joel aren't too different from one another. Let's use the example of Rick versus Shane in Season 2. Rick had to deal with Shane's outbursts of frustration with some of the choices Rick made whilst on Herschel's farm. Even though most fans in the community now actually agree with Shane's ideology now compared to Rick's, but I digress on that for now. Rick even gave Shane ample chances to cool down and to lead alongside Rick, even after Shane attempting to take out Rick with a set of Stilsons in the episode 19 Miles Out. He still tried to see the good in him and gave him a chance of redemption. Instead, Shane tried to lead Rick into a planned hunt for an escaped potential rival group member. Shane had killed this person earlier on and purposely led Rick out so they could be alone. Rick had an idea Shane was lying and what he was planning. It is at this point Rick realises that Shane is too far gone. He cannot be redeemed or trusted. Rick decides to end the turmoil with Shane. It is at this point Rick knew humanity could not be saved. He now only focuses on his own people and destroys anyone in their way. In a way, Rick ended up following Shane's ideology, but again, I digress. I feel at some point in Joel's 20 years into the collapse, he has certainly come across similar situations like this. Especially like he states, he's been on both sides. He knows how much evil is out there. Look how he first treated Henry and Sam. He wanted nothing to do with them. He attacked Henry on sight. He only went along with them because Ellie insisted so. But even when he becomes more relaxed around the pair, he is still cautious. He doesn't even really reveal his name right away, and I will talk about this again later. Even though Joel has met some good people throughout this journey, he knows that the bad in this world unfortunately outweigh the good, and he knows Ellie's potential sacrifice in reality isn't worth it. Although both Ellie and Joel didn't expect the outcome that was to come when they reached Salt Lake. Even if Ellie would have survived in giving the cure to the world, I still think this wouldn't have sat right with Joel. The only world he cares about now is his own, which includes Ellie. But even if the cure was created, how would it be administered, transported, secured? All these questions are commonly overlooked, and I will discuss them later. Right, I've been muttering on for long enough now. It's time to talk about Joel's final decision at the end of part 1. Joel and Ellie have spent nearly the past year to get to this point. They've also become inseparable by this point. Surrogate father-daughter. They will literally do anything for each other. We know their arrival to the hospital wasn't a smooth one. Ellie is unconscious, well, actually dead, and Joel was knocked out. Joel awakes on a hospital bed. Marlene explains that Ellie was brought back and instantly prepped for surgery. After a few hours of research, one doctor, the one and only Mr. Jerry Anderson, has found a cure out of Ellie's body's handling of the cordyceps. I personally still find this hard to believe. Research for possibly the only case like this would take months, if not years. Also, according to my research, there is no cure for any fungal infections in the world at this moment in time. But let's go with it anyway. On a side note here quickly, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I've only just remembered this far into writing this script. I'm avoiding using certain words that are related to our own current difficulties we're facing in our own world right now, because I know YouTube is listening, and if I mention that word that starts with V and ends in E, this video will be pushed to the bottom of the pile, so please do accept my reasons for doing this. I try to put a lot of effort into writing and analysing on these videos, and I would love it if more of the community could see them. Anyway, let's move on. Obviously, both Marlene and Joel know the outcome if this procedure goes ahead. Marlene keeps Joel under armed guard, and he is going to be escorted out of the hospital. Joel decides he doesn't really feel like doing that, and literally mows down all of the fireflies in his way to save Ellie, including Mr. Anderson, who tries to change his mind, but that didn't really go well. Joel escapes with Ellie down into the underground car park, and this scene plays.
You can't save her. Even if you get her out of here, then what? How long before she's torn to pieces by a pack of clickers? That is, if she hasn't been raped and murdered first.
It ain't for you to decide.
It's what she'd want. And you know it. Look. You can still do the right thing here. She won't feel anything.
I have mentioned this before, but look at Joel's reaction here.
It's what she'd want. And you know it.
Even though he and Ellie didn't expect her to have to die to give the cure, he also knows that Ellie, without a doubt, would have given her life for the cure, in respect of the people she has lost before and during this journey. However, on the flip side of this, the fireflies were going to operate on Ellie without her consent, even with no certainty of a cure being developed or being guaranteed to have a high effectiveness. But again, this could be seen as, well, take it away, Joel.
You sacrificed the few to save the many.
It's kind of shitty.
Yeah.
It's all down to moral choices at the end of the day. Marlene, of course, wouldn't want Ellie to give her life, but equally, it would be for the greater good, if something came out of it.
How can this be for the greater good? Shut it!
Joel does think the same by his reaction I played earlier, but he knows, like I aforementioned, that humanity isn't worth saving, and he knows she deserves a long life within the safety of Jackson. Joel also wants to fill that void he has had in his life for the last 20 years. He wants that chance to become a father again, and to care for Ellie as long as he can, until she decides to question his lie, in which I will discuss later. And of course, this side of it is definitely a selfish decision. But like I say, the other side is that he was saving her from the fireflies mainly, and that they were actually pretty incompetent if you think about it. Their numbers were already dwindling after the constant battles with Fedra. I mean, the guards at the hospital had no idea who Joel and Ellie were. Surely they were aware of them travelling to the area. They were also going to go ahead and perform a fatal surgery on Ellie without her consent. Without full certainty a cure could be feasible. There is also the logistical problem of getting this cure administered. With the firefly numbers dwindling, how would they set up sensors to distribute it? And who's to say, would they openly distribute it? Would they make people barter for it? Would they keep it for themselves? A lot of fans in the community forget about these little details. It's much more than just a potential selfish action by Joel. For me, the ending of part 1 leaves it open to the player to decide whether the actions of Joel were a moral one or a selfish one. I mean, that one touch of the watch could lead us into thinking it was purely a personal decision taken by Joel. But that was the beauty of Neil's writing back then. It's all simply left for you, the player, to determine this ending. Although Troy Baker, the actor who portrayed Joel, has recently came out and stated that Joel's actions were an honest but selfish one. So Mr. Baker is sitting on both sides on this one. So are both sides of the argument canon? Well, maybe. It's time to talk about the Joel that is presented to us in part 2. This is going to be very hard for me to keep neutral to the conclusion on this one, but I will try my best. So firstly, I'm not going to talk about Joel's demise right away, rather how the narrative of the game concludes that Joel's decision was a selfish one, and he almost is portrayed as the antagonist in this sequel. But before you say, I do completely understand as to what the narrative is trying to achieve, that not one character in this game is the antagonist. But when it comes to its portrayal of Joel, it just comes across that he is constantly being shunned for his decision at the Firefly Hospital. The start of the game subtly shows this by recapping the end of the first game, but again, it mainly focuses on the end of the first game. The main problem I see is with this clip here.
Sweet Jesus.
Doctor?
What are you doing? I won't let you take her. This is our future. Think of all the lives we'll save.
It may be just my observation here, but Joel's facial reaction here looked very aggressive. I thought this was unfair on Joel's character. His reaction in part 1 could of course be seen as an aggressive action, but in reality it was out of fear, the fear of losing Ellie. I'm not trying to condone what Joel did to Mr. Anderson, as well as the other Fireflies. I'm trying to get across that his actions were out of fear rather than aggression. We've all done stupid things out of fear, and then thought about it later. So that was my first observation when diving into part 2. I thought that was slightly unfair towards Joel. And of course, another large part of part 2's narrative, mostly in Ellie's flashbacks, are the constant reminder of Joel's lie to Ellie, and how supposedly damaging it was to Ellie. Joel's lie to Ellie was definitely a lie, I'm not denying it. However, was it a malicious lie? I don't think so. Sometimes we lie to ones we love to protect them. Some people, when they're hiding pain, i.e. mental pain, people lie to their families and or friends, telling them that they're fine. I think Joel's lie is similar. He lied to Ellie to protect her. Like I aforementioned, he wants Ellie to have a safe and long life in Jackson. But yes, there is also the side of, like I said, Joel wanting to keep Ellie close, so he could become her surrogate father. But I do believe his lie was not malicious. But with part 2, it reflects to me that Joel's lie is an evil one, that he is the big bad wolf, so to speak. Most of the flashbacks consist of Ellie digging at Joel about his decision at the hospital, as well as his lie. I did mention in my very in-depth video about Ellie in part 2, 1 minute she is questioning Joel's lie, but when she finds out the truth, she breaks down, reflecting to the player that in that scene she believed him all along, again pushing at what a monster Joel supposedly is. But like I have mentioned many times before, Ellie did not expect to die for giving the cure. Part 2 to me feels like it is kicking Joel to the curb. In the current timeline, he is treated as a sad old man that betrayed the world, as well as Ellie. Early cutscenes with Joel and Ellie in her house were fine, but there was some tension there, but this was okay, because like I say, Ellie knew Joel was lying, but kept it to herself. The game is constantly like this. Hey player, remember what Joel did to the Fireflies and Ellie? Here's another reminder. It is literally every flashback. There's always some reference. It's too much and it breaks the immersion and the love you had for these characters, because some players will become angry at Ellie for being so grouchy with Joel the whole narrative, and some will be mad with Joel as they're constantly reminded of the atrocity he caused at the hospital and betrayed Ellie's chance of a cure. But getting back to the current timeline, Joel, like I said, he's treated very unfairly, firstly by Ellie. Of course by this time she knows the truth, and it's clear she has pushed him away. The way she treated him at the party in Jackson, in the current timeline, was completely out of order. There was no need for malice. Ellie does instantly regret it though.
Hey! This is a family event.
Sorry.
Remember next time there's kids around.
Yeah, like you're setting such a great example.
Oh, just what this town needs. Another loudmouth dyke.
The fuck did you just say?
Ellie, Ellie, don't.
Get the hell out of here.
Get your hands off me.
Hey!
Enough. Come on, you. Let's go for a walk.
What about them?
You worry about yourself.
Let's get you some fresh air.
You all right, kiddo?
What is wrong with you?
He had no right.
And you do? I don't need your fucking help, Joel.
Right.
And in that same night, she begins to reconcile with him. But again, she has more digs at Joel. I have discussed this before, but she claims she was supposed to die in the hospital, and Joel took that chance from her, even though she had no idea she would have had to die. So again, it's another kick in the teeth for Mr. Miller. Now don't worry, I haven't forgotten. It's time to talk about Joel's demise. So hear me out first. I know I haven't done a great job staying neutral on this segment so far, but I think at least 90% of the community have a lot of discourse regarding not the fact that Joel died, more to how he died. Let me explain to the best of my ability. When we're playing as Abby, we're escaping a horde of runners and clickers whilst out looking for Joel, the man who killed Abby's father back in Salt Lake 4 years earlier. Conveniently, whilst escaping this horde, running in literally any direction, she runs into Joel and Tommy on patrol. This for me was the first red flag. Now most of us knew something was off with Abby from the start. Some of us did think that she was Ellie's mum in a flashback, myself included. But upon studying the dialogue, I knew she was an ex-Firefly, and others did come to the same conclusion. Either way, people were not impressed at the approach as to how Abby found Joel. It was all very coincidental, and there was clearly an over-reliance on it. Abby gets trapped by a runner, and Joel saves her life. We follow Joel and Tommy to their outpost, whilst quickly being surrounded by the horde. Joel and Tommy begin to introduce themselves, for who knows why. Of course, Abby now knows this is definitely the man she has been looking for, so she suggests they go back to her people's lodge for safety. So immediately, this was ringing alarm bells for me. Joel, as well as Tommy, are way too trusting right out of the gate, giving their names right out just after meeting someone and then willingly following them back to their hideout. Now I know they may well trust Abby, as she is a lone girl similar to Ellie's age, and may pose no threat in their eyes. And the fact that they are surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of infected, they know they don't have time to think about where to turn next. Maybe they also gave their names to Abby to keep her comfortable, to prove they're decent people. Like I aforementioned, she's similarly aged to Ellie, and in Joel's and Tommy's eyes, they know that a young girl following two grown men might make her uncomfortable, or slightly anxious. Perhaps that is why they gave their names right out of the gate. It's just for me, it seemed odd that these two hardened survivors we followed in part 1 have just in a mere 4 years have seemed to have gotten sloppy in their survival skills. But again, I have stated this in previous videos, but perhaps in their 4 years in Jackson has now made them let down their guard a little, reverting back to that suburban life they led before the collapse. And also remember, previous to this, Joel spent a large amount of time in the safe zone in Boston. He certainly never let his guard down there. But also, another flip side to this is that, for example, Ellie has been in Jackson that same amount of time as Joel, and as far as I can tell, she hasn't let her guard down at all, and seems as hardened as ever. Well, in the early parts of the game anyway. We all know how Part 2 destroys Ellie's character further on into the narrative. But also, Ellie has lived in this world from day one, so I guess she has never really learned how to let her guard down. Could just be me getting too carried away, but it could be another point to be had. Anyway, so Joel, Tommy and Abby make their way down to Abby's group's lodge. Admittedly, Joel and Tommy didn't have time to scope out the area, but again, the survivors I knew in Part 1 definitely would have scoped out the area first. But instead, the pair enter the building surrounded by Abby's crew. They state their names, again, and Tommy even mentions the whereabouts of Jackson and offers them a place to stay and supplies, etc. Of course, we all know what happens from here. So of course, I have a lot of gripes with this scene, but I will try to put that aside for now. So admittedly, a part of Joel's and Tommy's letting down of the guard is mostly because of their role within Jackson. It is to patrol for infected, but also help and welcome in survivors they encounter on the road. And most of the people they have run into have been decent people, and I think that was their mistake. They've been trusting people too quickly. As I've mentioned before, people in this world have to earn trust. But also the flip side to this, again I have mentioned before in past videos, but if we were shown evidence of past people Joel and Tommy have run into, we could get an idea of how they've become this soft, so to speak. But there is nothing shown, so the last impression we had of Joel and Tommy is back in Part 1 when they were hardened survivors. So when this scene plays out, it's just a big shock to the original players. I still just find it very naive of the pair to fall for this. But the minute Joel mentions his name, the whole atmosphere changes. Joel knows something is wrong, you can tell by his reaction. But of course by then it's too late. Troy Baker even mentions this himself.
I want to add on to that too. During that criticism, I have done a really good job, and primarily it's because of Neil that I've learned to not direct myself nor critique myself afterwards. It's almost impossible for an actor to not go, I would have done that differently, or oh. But instead, I've really focused on the scene that was chosen was the scene that was chosen because it was the scene that needed to be chosen. And the performance inside of those scenes were the scenes that were the performances that need to be chosen. And if people knew the lengths that specifically Neil and I went through, not including all of the other surrounding conversations that he had with every other person within Sony, within Naughty Dog, friends, colleagues, about that scene, but specifically Neil and I, been 2 times when Neil and I have argued. I was one of them, and it was because there were 2 people that desperately loved this character so much and wanted nothing more than for this character to be respected. And if Neil and I had arguably care about this character more than anybody else in this whole fucking world, ended up there in that scene, not to diminish or disrespect the opinions of others, have that conversation with us, then feel that way. That was not haphazard. It was so carefully, lovingly curated. There's the one thing that I fall back on for the criticism of my own performance there's a specific moment in that scene. The thought that Joel has is, this is what happens when you drop your guard. I allowed myself to trust. I allowed myself to love. I allowed myself to feel. I allowed myself to be safe. And this is what you get. It's a moment of regret. Even inside that moment, he goes, do it all over again. Because what I got was the girl. And the fact that that moment doesn't come through without a line of dialogue, moment of a look, if anything, falls on my failure to be able to present that moment. But rest assured, that moment is there for Joel.
I do get what Troy Baker is saying to a certain extent. After all, he does know this character more than any of us. But I don't understand exactly what he was saying about, quote, I got the girl and this is what happens when you let your guard down, end quote. Was he on about saving Ellie and this is the backlash from it, or him just saving her? And of course I get that Joel would certainly do it all over again. But Joel had no idea who these people were and why they wanted him dead. Hence why he asked the question. But in the end he didn't even really care. Abby never explained who she was or why she wants him dead. I mean, she said,
Guess.
but come on, this is Joel, with 20 years of murders under his belt. Abby's going to have to narrow it down a little bit. Now after what Joel did at the end of the first game, he must have known there may have been some backlash at some point, with someone bound to hunt him down. But after 4 years and him knowing fully well the Fireflies are pretty much non-existent at this point, I can't see him thinking this is a backlash from him saving Ellie. Either way, Troy confused me here a little bit. I did understand most of it, but sometimes he gets a little overpassionate and talks in riddles. I am still baffled though how Joel didn't know that it wasn't a good idea following this group into their property with no means of escape. I understand he trusted Abby as he saved her life and she helped them escape the Horde, but to trust the rest of her crew, But also the Joel we knew in part 1 never fully trusted Sam and Henry, not at least right away. He didn't give his name right away and always kept Ellie close and still kept his guard up. He kept his cards close to his chest when Henry was questioning where he was going. Also in the same clip I used with Troy Baker just now, Neil Druckmann, the creative director, also gave his take on the supposed ambush.
I want to just address that criticism because I've seen a lot of like, how come Joel and Tommy trust these people? And it's like, it's not an ambush. They're not walking into an ambush. And actually, Troy and I had a lot of conversations about how do they size them up. And actually, they don't want to stay there. They want to lead them back to Jackson because Jackson is safe.
Yeah.
And actually, what Joel is doing there is like he's sizing everybody up except for Abby because he believes that this girl that he just saved, that's the same age as Ellie, is safe. It's not. That wouldn't be the threat. The threat wouldn't come from there. So that's what catches him off guard. But also, again, it's the fact that these guys are not hunters. Like Joel's looking for hunters. These are regular people, just like the people that live in Jackson. And Joel has become a regular person that lives in Jackson as well.
So as you saw, Neil claims that it was not an ambush. Well, it sure looked like an improvised one to me, Neil. Again, there were telltale signs that this group were, for the lack of a better word, dodgy, to say the least. They were well armed, although to be fair, who isn't in this apocalypse? They had military-grade vehicles. That's not the sort of vehicle you have parked up at a lodge. This should have rung an alarm bell to Joel that this group are from a much larger group. Joel really should have spotted this hardware. I'm sorry to say, I know the man wrote and directed it, but I have to disagree with Neil on this one. From my analysis, I could tell an improvised ambush was coming. Now I'm someone with no survival skills, obviously, but I'd like to think I'm a good judge of character and surroundings. I could tell something was off when I first encountered this scene. I knew something was coming, but Joel, with 20 years of experience living in this world, couldn't see it coming. I just can't agree with that. And a disclaimer, I don't want anyone thinking I've got problems with Troy Baker or Neil Druckmann. Troy Baker is a fantastic actor and a veteran actor in the video game industry. He's also an all-round nice person. I've met the man himself back in 2019. He's a top bloke, seriously. And I really appreciate that he's passionate about his craft. He actually cares about the characters he portrays. Of course, acting is his bread and butter, but with Troy, it never seems like he's just after the paycheck and straight out the door onto the next project. He gets involved with the direction, scripts, and dives headfirst into it and gives it his all. And he always supports and talks about his past projects, even years after making them. Some actors, for example, when done with a project, they move on never to speak of it again. He is also open to constructive criticism and always critiques his performances. He's a very honest actor. As for Neil Druckmann, well, what can I say? He's one of the best writers and directors we've got in this industry, make no doubt about that. Look at the awards for The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 have won due to his input. However, I do think we should constructively criticise his work, like anyone else. Some of the writing in Part 2 certainly could have been handled better, and I'm always going to point that out. So it's time to conclude. As you've probably worked out by my analysis on Joel in Part 2, I think you know how I'm going to wrap this up. So let's summarise anyway, and I'll make my final verdict. Joel from The Last of Us Part 1 was a man with few moral lines left to cross after the loss of his daughter. Not long after the collapse, he spent the last 2 decades surviving in this new world, being on both sides, still whilst wearing the watch his daughter brought him all those years ago, hinting to us that even after all these years, he's still struggling to comprehend the loss. He has kept his past a secret from his peers, and when he receives the job for transporting Ellie, he puts his guard up. We know he does not trust himself to protect this one such girl that reminded him of Sarah. As well as Ellie reminding him of Sarah, he is also afraid of becoming close to her in case he loses her. As we know, this almost comes true when the pair arrive at Salt Lake City. The trust and bond between Ellie and Joel grows considerably on the journey. They are practically father-daughter at this point, and they'll do anything not to be separated. And once Joel finds out the reality of what is to become of Ellie after her surgery, with knowing how incompetent the Fireflies are, along with their dwindling numbers, Joel knows there is a slim chance of a cure being developed. Joel knows Ellie has much more life left in her. He does not want her to give her life just to save people like hunters who they have crossed on the journey. Joel's actions to save Ellie was completely honest and not at all selfish or heroic. Yes, I get that he didn't want to lose her, but a big part of his escape attempt was to mostly get her away from the Fireflies. His lie at the end, least to me, was not a malicious one. Could he have explained why the Fireflies were utterly useless? Well, maybe. But trying to explain this to Ellie, I don't think she would have believed him. Yet, when we come to Part 2, Joel's decision is considered a malicious one, and is shown as the antagonist of Part 2. We're constantly reminded of his so-called terrible decision, with Ellie constantly honour him in later flashbacks, as well as the current day narrative at the Jackson party, and the reconciliation scene. Even the nice museum segment is spoiled again by another Firefly reminder. But again, for me, Joel's decision wasn't malicious, yet he may well have wanted to fill that void in his life. But he also wanted to give Ellie the best life as possible, hence the first scene of the game and the museum flashback. But Ellie, as well as the writers, don't see it that way. Instead, Joel is kicked to the curb. His death was a complete disaster. Again, I do partly understand what Neil Druckmann and Troy Baker were saying, but they took that risk with how the death was executed. But for me, it just doesn't stick the landing. I get that whether you're a hero or a villain in this world, how you die is how you die. But Joel's death could have been prevented by his own analysis of what he was walking into. His death was designed to be cliché and shocking, to push forward the narrative, along with focusing on Abby and making the player empathise with her later on into the game. I knew Joel wouldn't have much of a part in this game before I played it. Like I aforementioned, many players, myself included, wasn't upset Joel died, just the direction of it. He went from this hardened survivor to a naive patroller in just 4 years, and had one of the poorest deaths in the medium. I haven't seen many fan favourite video game characters treated like this. I think I can confidently say that yes, Joel Miller quite simply did deserve better.